pollinating a tomato flower. Again, they do buzz pollination, and that's what this bee is doing. In order to unlock the pollen that's inside the flower here, it's going to vibrate those wings and cause the pollen to get released, and then it's going to brush them onto those back legs. The next group is in the subgenus Lazy Blossom as well, very closely related, but they look a little bit more like the other sweat bees. They're more just dark, they have a couple small stripes, and they vary in sizes. The last big group of sweat bees, the Ogochlorini. It's a tribe. It's not much of a taxonomic jungle, but it's three very closely related, very similar looking bees, genuses of bees that are going to be too hard to differentiate for all of us. They're broad generalists. They're seen throughout the year, but they really are unique in that their whole body is this bright metallic green that can look gold at times depending on the light and the time of year and the individual. They generally nest in the ground. They'll also nest in wood. When they're nesting in the ground, again, they're kind of digging their own nest in the ground. They will have multiple generations in the year, 1 to 2 generations. And again, I think they're some of the prettiest bees because they're just all bright green, kind of showing some gold sometimes, and a variety of plants that they'll pollinate. So here's a squash flower is pollinating, cornflower. Definitely worth looking for. At first glance, you might think it's just a fly or something, but they really are bees. All right, the next group are the megachilids, the big-lipped bees. Some of you have probably heard of bees like this before. When I start to talk about their more common names, they're small to large, but one thing that's really distinct about them is they have large mandibles, so large jaw pieces, and they're very hairy. Even the males are pretty hairy. The females have pollen-carrying hairs on their abdomens right here, which they'll put, and on their legs as well, but they're really unique having this under their abdomen. That'll help them store a lot of pollen, and the males have more hair on their front limbs. There's 3 common groups. Some of you have probably heard of mason bees before. There's often sold mason bee houses and stuff online. One reason why they're sold online, they're something that mason bees will use, artificial nesting structures, is because they use pre-existing cavities or holes, tunnels. Plant stems are something very common that they'll naturally use. If you think of like a thick sunflower stem, if that gets cut off and dried out over the year, that will create a little cavity for them to nest in. They'll use rotten logs, old beetle holes, as well as plant galls, so those swelling galls that you see on a lot of plants. Any little cavity that's long enough for them, they will partition with mud. They'll lay their eggs in, separate each cell where there's a developing egg with mud, which is why they're called mason bees, and fill out that cavity and move on to the next cavity for them to fill up throughout the year. Many of them specialize in flowers from the rose and pea families, which often are blooming in the spring. So you'll see these bees mostly in the spring. Apples, cherries, almonds, those are all in the rose family. Red buds, a beautiful tree we have around here. False indigo, lupin, those are in the pea family. And you'll often see mason bees in the spring pollinating these. The next group in the megachilid group are the wool carder bees. And these are 2 introduced species. And I know I'm supposed to be just focusing on the native bees, but once you start looking, you're going to notice these bees around because they are very territorial. Does that worry anybody? Don't let it worry you. The males are territorial, and males don't have stingers. All right, males are very conspicuous the way they fly around and defend their flower territory because they'll hover like flies, and they might ram other males around there. They might bump into some bumblebees that are pollinating nearby, but you're not going to get stung. Males can't sting. A female isn't going to sting you either. So they also, in this family, all of them nest in existing tunnels, so those same things, plant stems, reeds, wood cavities in decaying logs, things like that. We'll also have these large forelimbs. This is a male with a lot of hair on the forelimb. And they're pretty unique. You'll be able to identify at least these two species, the long wool carder and the European wool carder. They're called that because the females will scrape the top off of some leaf, the tops of leaves, get the fibrous material, which is kind of like wool, and use that in their nesting, in their nest cavities to partition their cells. So they're called that. This pattern on the back is pretty unique. You'll be able to kind of tell, you start to look, all right, that's not one of these other bees I've seen. It's a carder bee. The last group of megachilids are in the genus Megachilid, and they're the leafcutter and resin bees. Have you ever heard of leafcutter bees? It's another one like mason bees that are pretty well known because you can get bee houses for them, and they'll take to cavities and provision themselves in cavities. They're stocky, large-bodied, large mandibles like the rest of them. They have these long hairs on the abdomens again for collecting pollen. Many of them also have hairy forelimbs, especially the males. They also nest in existing cavities, and they'll partition each cell. They'll lay an egg, partition it, seal it up with leaf pieces, and move on to the next egg, fill that up, and move on throughout the cavity. Once that's full, they'll move on to another cavity. So you might find hole-punched leaves in your garden. So when they are cutting a leaf off, or pieces of leaf, you'll find kind of a hole punch cutout of the leaves there. It's a good sign that you have leafcutter bees. They have one generation per year, and they overwinter as pupa. So the females will emerge in the spring, along with the males. They'll mate. The female will then partition and lay all the eggs in her nest, fill it with the pollen for each individual egg, and then she will die, and then the eggs will develop into larvae, the larva into pupa, and then the pupa will stop developing. They'll pause their development throughout the winter and then emerge as adults in the spring. There's lots of species in Connecticut, including a couple, some introduced ones. The alfalfa leafcutter bee is one that is introduced. We're going to talk about that a little bit more at the end. But two that we have here that you might be able to reasonably tell apart are the pugnacious leafcutter bee, which is this big guy here, big jaws, big body. This is one of those smaller sweat bees in comparison to the size. It's probably twice as big. And then this is the flat-tail leafcutter. It's a short, stubby tail. It's wide, but again, covered in those pollinators. All right, the last big group of bees we're going to talk about are in the family Apidae. These are a diverse family with many unique genera. You probably wouldn't be able to tell that the next ones are really even related to each other. There's many specialists, generalists. This family is by far the most famous and well-known and economically important, mostly because of the bumblebees and the honeybees that are in this family. Starting off though, who thought this was a carpenter bee? This closest relative of this little bee is the much bigger carpenter bee that you'll see next. These are small carpenter bees in this genus Ceratina. There's two species in Connecticut and one subgenus. They're active spring to fall. They're solitary. They have one generation over the year, and they overwinter as adults. So the upcoming ones that will emerge finish developing as pupa because they have all season to grow in their nest cell. They wait out the winter and then emerge and breed and do it all over. They're generally small and metallic black bodies, but they also have scopa, scopal hairs here, which you'll see the bright yellow pollen build up. They nest in dead wood twigs and stems. They hollow out the pith, which is that spongy inner layer of plant stems. They dig that out and they dig down, and that's where they partition all their egg cells. The female only lives for 1 year. She'll do all the nest provisioning and egg laying throughout the first half of the year, and then she will kind of protect the rest of her nest from intruders, and then she'll die before the winter. The new young that the eggs that developed in the spring and summer will wait out the winter as adults, and then in the spring they will emerge and breed and continue what their mother started. They emerge about the same time that their mother did. Here are the large carpenter bees. We only have one species in New England, the eastern carpenter bee, mostly solitary, but sometimes they do social nesting with their sisters. Then it's usually just one generation per year. Probably this is a pretty familiar bee. It's either thought it's a giant bumblebee, or you've seen it digging into your house. They nest in solid wood that they chew out themselves, but generally they avoid wood that's painted white, so if you do have problems, but they don't really cause damage that outweighs the benefit that they serve in pollination purposes. They are occasional nectar thieves, where they'll bite off, like this one is doing, it's biting off the flower. Instead of sipping the nectar where it's coming from, they sort of bite off the spigot and drink the nectar without actually pollinating it. But usually they're effective pollinators. The next group are the longhorn bees. These are mostly in the genus Melisodes. They're active in July and August for the most part. They stand out because they have a very, very long, especially the males, these long antennae. They are sunflower specialists, especially in this one subgenus, Eumelisodes. And then there's also the two-spotted longhorn bee, which I'll show in a second, which is more of a generalist. But if you grow sunflowers, I bet you've seen these and not realized it. And so this coming summer, when you start growing sunflowers again, look for these when they start to bloom. You'll see a lot of them probably. Most of them have green eyes as well. Males and females are hairy. So again, here's the one, a sunflower specialist, and this is a two-spotted longhorn bee, which almost looks just like a black bumblebee, but it has on its backside a whitish yellow spot here, and then on the reverse side. This is pollinating watermelon flower here. Another really, really special bee in that same group, longhorn bees, is the squash bee. We have one species of squash bee that's seen whenever squash are blooming. So June, July, August, whenever your zucchinis and pumpkins are blooming, you will hopefully have squash bees. They're a squash specialist. It's the only group of flowers that they will collect pollen and drink nectar from. If you don't have those flowers around, you won't see squash bees. They're very efficient pollinators. They get the job done. It's the only flower they focus on. They spend a lot of time in those flowers. They even sleep in the flowers when they're done for the day. If you ever go up to some of your withered zucchini blooms later in the day, you might see some squash bees inside sleeping. They're also very efficient because they get up early. If you want to see these bees active, you need to get up like 5 in the morning and look at your zucchini blossoms. If you look by 8 or 9, they're going to be gone, and it'll just be bumblebees looking for the leftovers. The honeybees haven't even woken up yet. Squash bees get the work done early. That's why they are more efficient pollinators than honeybees are. They nest in the ground near their food source. So if you're growing zucchinis, you don't need a rototill. You're going to destroy all the overwintering honeybee or squash bees that are in the ground. Bring up all the seeds in the seed bank as well, so you don't need to till. Like I said, they sleep in these withered blossoms at the end of the day. Males have this yellow-white patch on the face here. This male's just waiting for a female to come around. Females don't have that patch. They both have this sort of black and white stripe on the back, and you'll often see them like this just hanging out in the flower. The last group of bees here are the nomad bees, which are cuckoo bees. They're kleptoparasites. They go into nests of other species of bees, lay eggs in there. Those eggs will develop faster than the host eggs. Those nomad bee eggs will eat all the host eggs, eat all the pollen that the mother has collected, and then pupate at the same time next year that the host's eggs would have. That's not too uncommon. Happens in there's wasps and bees that do this. There's several species that we have. They're very hard to tell apart, but they parasitize a particular host species. And they have host species that are out in the spring, summer, and fall. So you can see nomad bees throughout the growing season. They are usually bright red, like this. So again, you probably wouldn't have ever thought it was a bee. And they do visit flowers quite often for nectar. You'll often see them, they're called nomad bees because nomad means wanderer. They'll often be seen sort of wandering around bare ground looking for the nest hold of their host species. So this is one that's kind of blackish red and then black and yellow on the standalone. And then here is one coming out of minor bee hole. So it was hovering around, they'll just sit and lurk and wait to see the host come out and then fly in and take up the hole, lay its eggs, and then leave. That's all they do. They don't do any other provisioning. All the pollen collecting duties is on the host to fill up the nest with pollen. It may not sound very glamorous, or it may sound like we want to vilify them, but we don't. They're part of the ecosystem. They add to biodiversity. So they are still important and very unique. You'll see them when you start looking for them and you see these red bees, you'll know it's a nomad bee. Bumblebees are probably the most well-known native bee that we have. There used to be about 16 species in Connecticut. That's what was on record here since the 1900s. They are one of the more imperiled groups of bees that we have. There's 5 species that are common today. Common eastern bumblebee, probably all seen, never noticed. You probably all thought perhaps that most of these are all the same species. But they are, because they're difficult to tell apart. There's a few different ways to differentiate them. I don't know them that well, depending on the types of hair, the look of some of the hair. But the 5 you're most likely to see in Simsbury are the common eastern bumblebee, the half-black bumblebee, 2-spotted, brown-belted, and the perplexing bumblebee. There's also 2 parasitic species of bumblebees. So bumblebees that actually will, just like the nomad bee, will go into the hive, the colony of bumblebees, kill the queen, and take over the egg-laying duties. So all the former workers of the dead queen take care of the parasite's brood. Those 2 species that we have are also in decline because their hosts are in decline so much. I'll touch on this again, but the main reason most of those species are in decline is because of diseases that were spread from commercially reared bumblebee hives. Because bumblebees are such good pollinators and they do nest socially in a colony, people started making captive hives and bringing them around the country for their pollination services, just like honeybees can get hired out. Bumblebees started to do that with common eastern bumblebees and 2-spotted bumblebees, but as typically happens when you have a large concentration of species, of individuals in one area, diseases start to spread. And when those commercially reared bees were put out into different areas, they were spreading diseases from one part of the country to another and interacting with the wild bees that were in those places. And that's been that has resulted in most of our native bumblebee species to decline, and some of them we haven't seen in the state for hundreds of years, for over 100 years or so. So that's really the biggest threat for bumblebees is diseases from commercially reared colonies. For the most part, they're generalists. They're active spring to fall. The common eastern bumblebee is the one that you'll probably see, even if there's some blooms, but it's below 30 degrees, you might still see them out there. They'll be active early in the year, all the way to the very late in the year. They're large, hairy, which makes them effective pollinators. They're good at grabbing pollen, just like this lady here. Is going to bring it back to the nest. All bumblebees nest in the ground. For the most part, they're all social and colonial. They can have 200 workers and a queen. So it's different than a founders. They actually have a queen and her daughters as the workers. Multiple overlapping generations, another thing indicative of a colonial social species. So the daughters will help raise the next generation of daughters, but the whole colony only lasts 1 year. The future queens, so next year's queens, are born along with the males late in the season. They're the last generation of the year. They'll mate, and then the female will go and look for a suitable place to overwinter. So somewhere underground or in the leaf litter, rock walls, things like that. And then in the spring, they'll disperse and find a place to have their own colony. They do collect nectar for their young, but they don't dehydrate it like honeybees. Dehydrated nectar is honey, and honeybees are the ones that do it. So these are 3 of the species, common species. This is a common eastern bumblebee. This is a perplexing bumblebee. It's much brighter yellow. The yellow extends further down. There's a lot of variation though in all these species as well. And this is the brown belted, which this last segment is a brownish yellow. You might be able to tell these 3 if you have them visiting some of your gardens. The brown belt, the normal average looking bumblebee, and then this perplexing or confusing bumblebee, which is usually bright yellow and a lot more of it around. The last bee is the European honeybee. Honeybees are not native to North America. They were introduced during the colonial period. They are unique compared to the other bees that I've talked about in that they have a perennial colony. So the colony lasts more than 1 season. It supports thousands of workers, and something that honeybees and bumblebees have, they don't have the scopa hairs on their legs. Instead, they have pollen baskets, which they mix a little bit of nectar with to create the sticky bit on their legs, which is, this is a pollen basket here. So it's a mix of nectar and pollen that it stores there. European honeybees, they store that nectar in the hive, it dehydrates in the cells, and then that is fed to their larvae. Commercially, they're very valuable, just because they can be moved around and they can have so many bees in a small area from them. So commercially and economically, honeybees are still valuable for our agricultural system, but they aren't as effective at pollinating per bee as a lot of our native species. They can't buzz pollinate. All right, so some of the other non-bee bees. When people think of bees, many of you maybe tonight, before you came here, when you thought of bees, you thought of honeybees, bumblebees, and maybe yellow jackets. All right, you see some things flying around, it kind of looks like a bee, but it's not. These are pollinating flies. Eastern calligraphers, there's mimic flies, flower flies, different hover flies. They all resemble bees. They have this black and yellow striping, and it's a form of mimicry used to avoid predation. They're still valuable pollinators. They aren't as valuable economically as our bees, but you'll still see them regularly around your flowers. So don't mistake them for bees. Identify them and appreciate them as flies. They're still cool. The other non-bee bees are the wasps. And when most people are afraid of getting stung by a bee, or get stung by a bee, or find a ground bee nest or something like that, they don't mean bees. They mean a wasp, and social wasps. There are a few conspicuous species, because when they're around, you usually know it. The yellow jackets, hornets, paper wasps. These are social wasps that nest together. There's a hierarchy, so there's an egg laying, and then there's sisters that are out collecting prey. Most of these are carnivorous, which is pest control for your garden, and agriculturally, the pest control services that they provide are very important to the economy and to the environment. Individually, one of them is nothing to worry about. When a yellow jacket's flying around you, one, it's not a bee, it's a wasp. It's a social wasp. Two, if you don't bother it, it's not going to bother you. It might crawl on you and explore you. It might get sweat off you. It might be investigating the can of soda you're drinking. It's not there to attack you. You can be very close to a hive if you don't bother it. Oftentimes you will see these social wasps, the paper wasp hives up in trees or hanging on the eaves of your house or something like that. Just because you see it and they see you doesn't mean they're going to attack you. They can aggressively defend a nest if it's disturbed, if you knock it down or something, but for the most part, if you let them be, they're not going to bother you. So don't freak out if you see these in your garden. They're there for a reason, good pest control. They visit flowers though for their nectar and for the prey. Most of the wasps that we have are responsible for a multitude of plant-insect interactions, not just the wasp and their prey, but they help with the pest control all around. There's hundreds of species in Connecticut. Nearly all of them are parasitic. They have a specific prey species that they look for, whether it be crickets, grasshoppers, stink bugs, caterpillar larvae, ants. There are parasitic wasps that target one prey species, or one group of species. And that type of pest control is very important economically. And these are almost always unbothered by people. I mean, these are mostly my cell phone shots being an inch away from them. They don't care. I know they can be big and intimidating, but they're not going to bother you. One of them that, maybe takes the most work to not be afraid of is the gray golden digger wasp, but these are everywhere on your milkweed, mountain mint. They're going to be everywhere, a lot of them. They're beautiful. They eat katydids, grasshoppers, crickets, locusts, so they're a good thing to have around. They're beautiful to look at. They're not going to hurt you. Another beautiful group of wasps are the cuckoo wasps. There's dozens of species of cuckoo wasps. I'd never be able to tell them apart, but some people can, scientists can. And here they are visiting, collecting nectar to drink for themselves. These cuckoo wasps actually parasitize other wasps and bee nests. So it'll do the same thing that the nomad bees do, but for other wasps. Thread-waisted wasps are another really, really common one. A lot of these are also eating spiders, different things like that. So there's lots and lots of wasps. Not something to be afraid of either, but something to appreciate that it's there, and hopefully be interested in identifying what it is, not being afraid of it. All right, so our native wasps are under threat, native bees. The wasps do, all of them. The main threats to our native bees are pesticides, diseases, climate change, and a couple other things on the next slide. Pesticides, as much as it might be marketed as natural, safe, organic, all this stuff, a lot of these things are still lethal to insects, broadly to insects, and that includes bees. All right, this is from a study that was published a few years ago, showing a number of different botanical, so natural things that their effects on bees, and they were, a variety of them, all had high mortality effects on either adults or larval honeybees. If it's having those effects on honeybees, it's also going to be having those effects on native bees as well, and insects in general. So pesticides are a big issue, especially improper use of pesticides. And that doesn't just include insecticides. Pesticides include herbicides, fungicides, etc. All these have a wide-ranging impact on the environment. Things like bees having microbiome, a gut microbiome, just like we do. So there's a number of things that can affect the gut microbiome of bees and affect how much weight they can put on and affect their survival throughout the year. So think about all the things that you don't want to be putting into yourself. Same thing goes for a lot of the insects around us. Just because it might be safe to expose our skin to doesn't mean it would be safe to eat a large quantity of. Imagine being an insect and being exposed to large quantities of these types of compounds. I mentioned the diseases earlier, particularly for the bumblebees. Different diseases, though, can still affect a lot of the cavity nesting bees, and I'll talk about it now. A lot of the mason bees, leafcutter bees, they're marketed for hotels, bee hotels, things like that. There's some debate in the scientific community about whether those are beneficial or good or not. Good for the bees. Yes, it provides extra nesting sites, but it also is a place for other predators to focus in on a large concentration of bees. It's also a place for more mites and diseases to affect bees. So it's been found in a number of these different large kind of bee hotel, bee colony type things where there's higher outbreaks of mites that affect the survival of lots of bees. Climate change is affecting bees. It's one of those things where the timing of the emergence for some of these, especially the spring bees, the timing, if that gets off by a few weeks, where the bees emerge and the flowers have already passed their bloom that they specialize in, if that doesn't line up, then the bees won't be able to collect as much pollen resources, won't have as much survival year after year after year, and that can cause a decline in populations for those species. So it may not feel like much, but if you depend on the timing of 3 or 4 weeks, I have to get everything done in these 3 or 4 weeks, and it shifts little by little, over decades, it'll have an impact on that population. A couple of the other big threats that we all have an impact on: habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, and overall destruction of habitat. Native bees don't travel as far as honeybees do. Honeybees travel much further distances to collect their pollen and nectar. Native bees depend on those resources to be around in the area, in a much closer area. And as we've fragmented our habitat, our landscape more and more over the last couple decades, it becomes harder for those populations to maintain connectivity with each other. It's harder for them to find all their resources in the right area, and so they are less successful and they'll die out in small groups here, here, here. And so overall in the population, the numbers decline. Additionally, in Connecticut and Simsbury overall, the last 20, 30 years now, we've had a major conversion of what used to be natural habitat, forests, agricultural lands, into developed and turf grass. Turf grass is now the most common crop grown in Connecticut. It's considered a crop. It's turf grass. It's maintained. It's manicured. It's grown just like any other crop. It's considered a crop, and it's now the largest cultivated crop in Connecticut. So all of that has affected the amount of space there is for bees. Because we mow our lawns, our lawns are not suitable places for bees to find what they need. And it's replaced a lot of the habitat around them. So this is for Simsbury specifically, and this is overall in the state. So it pretty much mirrors statewide what's happened in Simsbury over the last 35 years or so. So what are some things that you all can do to help bees? You can protect existing nesting sites. Each one of those groups, I talked about the type of nest they have. In the ground, protecting bare ground. In leaf stems, in dead wood. Look around your property and find where those things might already exist and protect them, augment them, enhance them. All right, leave last year's stems up. Cut off the tops if you need to, but let the bottom 2 feet or so stay throughout the spring. There's probably some bees nesting in those stems that are going to emerge come springtime. Bees don't need the hotels. If you have enough habitat around, that will do more good for them than having some bee hotels. Bare ground for those minor bees and all the other ones like that nest in the ground. It doesn't mean you have to turn your yard into a big sand heap, but some of the edges of your property, allow them to be unmaintained. Areas that maybe aren't going to be quite so in the public view if you're worried about that. You don't have to turn your yard into a big meadow to have a valuable impact on the pollinators, on these bees. Try to maximize your plant diversity in the yard. Look out the plants that you have already, see when they're blooming. Find the gaps when you don't have flowers blooming, native plants blooming, and try to fill those. Try and find plants that bloom during that period of time. Your goal is to have a succession of blooms from April through November. And then think about the broader landscape. Your little postage stamp of property, you might not think how much impact can this have, but if you take some of these actions, your neighbors do, that helps to increase that connectivity that we've lost due to fragmentation. Mowing's a big controversy in a lot of these pollinator circles. It's hard to not mow your lawn for some people. Try to mow less frequently, and mow high. The higher you mow, the less destructive you'll be, and the better for the grass it is. You'll get a thicker lawn anyway, more roots. And as I talked about before, reduce and eliminate those pesticides if you can. All right, take some questions now.